Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I'm here once again with the GOAT himself, the greatest of all time, Erick Ybarra. Erick, it's so great to have you on the podcast again.
Thank you, Suan. Yeah, I don't live up to that, that's for sure. But I'm looking forward to have some fun.
All right. Well, Erick, today we are here to talk about Gavin Ortlund's recent video on whether the emperors actually ran the first 7 ecumenical councils. But before we get to that episode, I just wanted to say, Erick, it's really great to have you back on the channel. And when I do my apologetics work in the Diocese of Bridgeport, I actually mention you as kind of like one of the model apologists. Like this guy can write like a 600 700 page tome on the papacy. You can do it too. Well, maybe, but you can do great things. And so
Yeah.
Erick, it's just so great to see a lay expert such as yourself.
Thank you. It's very kind.
All right. Well, I'm going to first, before we get to the video, pull up a page of Ortlund's book on the case for being Protestant, just to help us understand like where Ortlund is coming from. Like, why would we care about whether or not the emperors ran the first 7 ecumenical councils? So this is Joshua Charles' picture. So I hope he doesn't mind if I show his fingers on the screen. But I'm just going to read a bit of the paragraph here. And Erick, if you want to say anything or if you understand the argument differently from Gavin's side, you let me know. All right.
Yeah.
All right. So Gavin says on page 113, quote, "Similarly, papal supremacy as defined by Vatican I is not representative of the first millennium of Christianity. This can be seen in many ways. One is how popes relate to ecumenical councils. Lumen Gentium, a dogmatic constitution promulgated at Vatican II, stipulates the role of the Pope in relation to ecumenical councils, and it just talks about how it's the prerogative of the Roman pontiff to convoke, preside, and confirm ecumenical councils." Gavin goes on to say, in contrast to this, none of the first 7 ecumenical councils were convoked or presided over by a Roman bishop. Rather, the emperor did so. And then he goes into a bit more down at the bottom. So he says, like, maybe some people have tried to argue that the Roman bishop had the authority, but simply didn't exercise it. And Gavin asks, is that plausible? What would be the point of the Pope having such a prerogative only to never use it with respect to any of the early ecumenical councils, even in times of dire need? All right, long story short. Erick, what do you say to that just initially? Or do you have any comments there?
Yeah, to be honest, that's the first time I've seen this. But now that I've seen this, because thus far I've listened to the video,
right?
But I didn't see this. It does look like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like what he's saying is Vatican I makes this claim about the authority of the Pope, but in contrast to that, the first 7 councils don't reflect what Vatican I says. Rather, they reflect a different understanding of church authority in the way things are decided. Is that
yeah, I mean, I think what Gavin's saying here from like Vatican II and Vatican I, we can lump that in together. He's saying that basically when you look at how the early ecumenical councils were run, right, in the first millennium, it's really the emperors who seem to be doing the work that the Pope is supposedly supposed to do, right? And so this seems maybe at odds with papal supremacy. Obviously, the first sentence says, he argues that it's not, papal supremacy is not representative of the church in the first millennium. And I guess he's using this as a counter, as a evidence for that claim, because it's the emperors who are running the councils, not the popes.
Yeah. See, I wouldn't read the data that way. I would say that there's a very good reason for why the first 7, and even like for us Catholics, the 8th, the 9th, and beyond, there's a very good reason why emperors did what they did. But it was never designed, and it was never something that functionally opposed the supremacy of the Pope or of the church, because really, when you're erecting the spirit, the power of the state, the power of the king or the empire, in contradistinction to the Pope, you're also doing it in contradistinction to the church, right? Of which the Pope represents. But I would see that I wouldn't see this. I would say that we have to look at why those 7 councils were organized the way they were, and also make it clear that the available historical data does show papal supremacy at work in those very councils.
Right. Yeah, and Eric, you've done like a really great response video on my channel to Gavin on Pope Vigilius, but you also in that response video like went through the case for papal supremacy and infallibility in the first millennium. And I don't know if I've ever seen like Gavin actually respond to that presentation or all the hard work that you've done, but it's just worth saying like, you've done the work and so when you are coming here putting it all together, you're bringing a much more holistic perspective than what I think Gavin is doing, if I can say so respectfully.
I don't remember a response video. I think, and to be fair, his video was shorter,
Sure.
but you know, was longer because I wanted to kind of go in and untangle some of what I thought were knots. Sometimes our friendly opponents create knots. And you have to untangle those knots first. Then you can, have a chance to freshly present the case for the Catholic faith. So sometimes the response videos are longer, and
Right.
that's just the nature of scholarship and research.
Well, I hope that Gavin takes a look at this video or your work and interacts with it more, because I feel like at this point we've been doing this conversation for years now, and it kind of reminds me how sometimes like when I'm talking to my Eastern Orthodox friends, they'll say things like, okay, the papal claims were never made in the first millennium, and it's like, okay, come on, not even your own scholars are saying that. Right, we got to move on at some point to the real stuff of the debate. We can't get stuck on talking points from like 50 years ago. Anyway,
but
Eric, you ready to?
Yeah, and I was gonna say
Go ahead.
what's good about Dr. Ortlund is that, unlike the Ortho Bros or the Orthodogs or whatever they're called nowadays, every time I hear that, I think of like Stranger Things, the Demodogs, right? And they call them the Orthodogs now. Of them are very hesitant to go into scholarship. They don't want to even hear it. But the hope with Dr. Ortlund is that he's very tuned in with the scholarship, and so he respects the scholarship. So when we bring the scholarship around, he can, obviously scholarship's not infallible, but it is helpful, and he respects the weight of scholarship. So whenever it's on our side, then he owes us the debt of recognition.
Sure. Yeah, and I remember too in the previous video that we did, it was like I think he mentioned, was it the scholar Brian Tierney who said something like papal infallibility didn't start until the 14th century or something along those lines?
Yeah, that one was Brian Tierney is one of those famous medievalists that has proven to be like the most powerful weapon in the arsenal of Orthodox and Protestant and or those just seeking to critique the papacy. And Brian Tierney, I looked at his research, and he's thinking we don't see the precise teaching that when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, it is in and of itself irreformable, infallible, and all these things. But he makes like that's a monumental, significant observation when we've got people in the third century that say the Church of Rome is infallible. And so, it's like, how much of a graduation do you have between the claim the Church of Rome was divinely founded and is infallible, and when the Pope speaks ex cathedra? Those two things are more of it's just like a snapshot of a flower that's unfolding at one primitive state to a more mature state. And
Right.
Brian Tierney makes it sound like it is just this novel implosion, like that just came out of nowhere with some Franciscan dispute in the Middle Ages. And I think I don't think that bears up with that. We went through slide after slide after slide of non-Catholic scholar who actually did the research and said,
Right.
well, if we keep our finger here, and if words mean what they mean, then it's different.
All right, Eric, you ready to get started?
Yes.
All right. And the way we're going to do this is basically, I'll have the video up on the screen. Eric, you tell me when to pause, and I'll pause when I have a comment. And for those of you in the audience, I would say hold off on your questions until we get maybe near the end of the video. And I know, Eric, you have some slides, and so let me know when you want the slides on the screen. All right.
Okay.
All right.
In the early church, Roman emperors played a significant role in the ecumenical councils. Some people are surprised how much this is the case. Generally speaking, leaving room for some qualification that we'll work through, Roman emperors convoked or summoned or called together ecumenical councils. They funded and organized them. They presided over the procedures, sometimes through representatives. We'll talk through that one at great length. They enforced the decisions legally, and sometimes they influenced or pressured outcomes, sometimes at pretty tight control. We'll give some examples. I looked back into this topic more thoroughly this past week because there was a little flare up on X where I had made a passing remark about emperors presiding over the 7 ecumenical councils, and Joshua Charles quoted this and declared this to be a kind of ridiculous error. And he was questioning my honesty and calling me an internet troll and things like this. But what I said is correct. And as much as I don't like getting in the back, I don't like the online culture of, who's owning who and this kind of thing. I'd much rather have open-hearted conversations with good faith people. And there's so many good faith Catholics, even those who criticize me, some great people. But sometimes what I'm kind of learning is people watching can be swayed if you don't respond to these because they're said so aggressively. So even though this is plainly incorrect, and what I said is the standard way of summarizing the data, let's work through that. What I thought I'd do is, wait a few days and then just work through the data and just show people, so this is an important topic and sometimes people can benefit from just seeing the facts. So not to prolong something, but for clarity for onlookers who may be swayed by this, wondering, well, is that true? Yes, Roman emperors presided over the early ecumenical councils. That is absolutely.
So, Eric, I wanted to pause here really quick and just see if you have any comments, but could I ask you a question first? Maybe just to clarify. So, when Joshua raised his original kind of posts on X and questions, it had to do with whether, preside is the right word for what's going on here in terms of the role of the emperors and what Vatican II is talking about, so on and so forth, with in the Pope's role presiding over councils. Is there anything that you want to comment there about like the meaning of the word preside, let's say in the case of Vatican II versus here?
Yeah, it's a question, and I think here I think we need to back up and really remind the audience that what there is a scholar. I have a slide on this. We could probably, but we have to recognize that an ecumenical council is often taken for granted as of divine institution, as if Jesus, our Lord, and the apostles taught, that is called an ecumenical council, and it's part of the Catholic Church. It's part of the apostolic deposit. You must use it in order to make final decisions on the faith. And that's not really the case. Nobody before the Council of Nicaea was thinking, oh, guys, when are we going to finally have one of those things that Jesus and the apostles talked about, the great ecumenical council? When is it going to happen? Like in 150 AD, 250 AD, we're still waiting. When is this going to happen? Nobody thought that way. And so it is true that the ecumenical council, just the form, the material, the I don't want to say substance, but the outward form and material of an ecumenical council is not a church creation. And this is what I think sometimes people in the background, the listeners, the readers sometimes they need to keep this in mind. I'm sure many have already known this, but there are some who are bound not to know that we don't have a problem with the idea that the Roman Empire is really the creator of these early ecumenical councils. That's not a problem for the Catholic Church, because when we have a doctrine of the two swords. There's the spiritual power and there's the temporal power, and both of them are subject to the one God of heaven. And so the ecumenical councils when they started in the 4th century, it was an imperial measure taken for the realm of the secula, of the world. So Constantine didn't just gather together the Council of Nicaea so that all the Christians can go back to their little houses and their whatever buildings were restored to them and have peace inside of them. Now he convened the Council of Nicaea for the public, also for the public sphere of Christian society. And that and all the emperors after who tried to do the same thing, that's what they were doing. They knew that the spiritual power resided in the hands of the bishops underneath the successor of Peter. Not every one of them, not at every year, not at every time, but this was a predominant theme and pattern. And so they knew that the bishops, that was their sphere. But when it came to the management of the public realm, they took their responsibility seriously. And the church likewise would call upon the state to act on its responsibility given to it by God. And the state would in turn call upon the bishops to act upon their spiritual responsibility with regard to the faith. And so you've got those two powers. If you don't see a distinction between them, then this whole discussion can kind of meld together. And so when you talk about an emperor convening and ratifying an ecumenical council, it's like most people are like, well, where's the Pope, Roman Catholic? Well, the Pope is in Rome and he's watching the emperor do his job. Because an ecumenical council, as they began, those were imperial responsibilities. Now, he called the bishops together, that's for sure. But the goal that the emperor was trying to get out of it was yes, peace in the church, but really peace in the commonwealth, peace in the Roman society, which at that time was Christian. And so we have to keep that in mind, that the short answer to the question, why weren't the popes personally present? Why wasn't it, why were the emperors so invested with the management, the financial management, the logistics, the ratification, the enforcement? Because the short answer is that was not the church's job. You got to let the state do its job. Okay. Now, before we hit play again, just one more point, Suan. There's a huge contrast in the second millennium. Okay. The ecumenical councils in the second millennium begin to take on a different form externally and I don't want to say substantially, but in its material and form, it kind of radically changed.
Well, Eric, you were talking about basically how things started changing in the second millennium. It's not really the emperor doing much of the practical machinery right now. It's more on the lap of the Pope. So I was wondering if you could talk about what shift happened in the second millennium.
Yeah, well, the whole power dynamic in the West, Western Europe changed. You had the beauty of the Roman Empire that went away the first time in the 4th, 5th centuries, and then in the 5th century, and it suffered a couple of collapses, right? But then you have the rise of New Rome and the Byzantium. We call it Byzantium, right? It was really the Roman Empire of the time, but that went on for centuries, and during the iconoclastic controversy, there was this sort of fissure between the East and the West, and the Patriarchate of Rome consulted with Western kings in order to procure protection, civil safety, and basically a military to defend the Christian commonwealth that the Byzantine emperors were not always there to support. And so that sort of lit the match, and it eventually grew over centuries into its own independent entity outside of Byzantium. And in that dynamic, the Roman pontiff played such a powerful role, not just spiritually, but even in the civil realm. And ecumenical councils from the councils of the church still convened locally, from area to area, France and Germany. But when they were convoking large councils, the Roman pontiff was now in a position to do so, and that's just the nature of the change at that point in time. The way the church by then had a greater understanding of, well, the Pope is really going to have to ratify these decrees anyway. He's in a position that has respect from all the princes and the kings. And so the emperor at that time gave basically the role to the Pope to convene these councils, although emperor still played a role. Florence, for example, emperor was he thought he was the one presiding at that council in Florence. But yeah, so there was a change. So by the time Vatican I's talking about convocation, presidency of councils, it's really thinking of the Council of Trent, the Lateran synods, even the Catholic Encyclopedia on general councils has to make this qualification that in the first millennium, we see the emperors convoking the councils. But even when they convoke those councils, the popes are the ones that have to review and ratify them in order for them to have any kind of ecclesiastical authority. So that qualification is made by all the historians. Yeah.
All right, Eric. So while you were gone, I made a bunch of great points, but unfortunately, it was just me talking to the camera in the live chat. So hopefully, I'll be able to bring up those points again to have your thoughts on them. But anyway, let's go on with the video, Eric.
Okay.
Absolutely the case. What I said is correct. And let's just work through this. And I think people will be helped to see the results here, the details of walking this through. Francis Dvornik is an older Catholic priest and scholar. He taught at Harvard for several decades, I meant to say. He looks old. He's not that old. And he wrote a definitive article on this whole topic back in the mid-20th century. The scholarship's kind of moved on from him a little bit, but nonetheless, this is a helpful starting point. He starts off the article saying, the role played by the emperor in the first ecumenical councils is a question of greatest importance. All available documentary evidence shows that the convocation of the first ecumenical councils was made not by the popes or bishops, but by the emperor himself. The emperors or their assistants presided at synods, directed the debates at meetings, and confirmed the decisions made by the assemblies. By the way, we're going to get into why this is so important and why this matters ecclesially for our relation to church history at the end of the video. Note those words, though, or their assistants. That is one key reason why we need to be careful. This does get tricky, and this is why I offered on X the terminological concession to say maybe we should use the word oversee, because that's a more general word. The word preside is accurate, but it's ambiguous because some people can hear that as thinking, well, the emperor is always personally running all the meetings, and that did not happen at every ecumenical council. Nonetheless, the word preside is also fine, and that's a standard way to put it. The presidency of the emperor, you'll read about this if you get into the literature on this topic. Here's how the great Protestant church historian Philip Schaff puts it. To this presidency of the emperor or of his commissioners, the acts of the councils and the Greek historians often refer. Even Pope Stephen V writes that Constantine the Great presided in the Council of Nicaea. That's a 9th century pope he's referencing there. But let's kind of work through this. We'll look at Nicaea and we'll look at the first several councils, just kind of looking at some of the nuances, because this does get tricky. With Nicaea in 325, this is important to start here because this council really became the model for subsequent councils that later councils then look back to.
Eric, do you want to say anything about Dvornik's research or anything about him as a scholar, anything so far?
No, I mean, Dvornik is just, he's just stating the facts, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the issue is when someone reads that without being informed about the two different gas pedals of the spiritual power and the temporal power, they'll meld them together. And so it kind of looks like when Dvornik says that, like right off the page, it sounds like, wait a minute, what in the world is the Roman emperor doing, convoking the councils and all these things? Because we're reading it in our culture, our geopolitical context. If you go back then, Dvornik explains this at length, that at that time, Constantine was simply he was operating off of the old, ancient, late antique, the Hellenistic idea of king over the realm who doesn't just oversee like the non-religious part of society, but he also has to oversee the religious part of society. And the way that he knew how to do that was borrowed from the Roman senatorial procedure, which is why the Council of Nicaea, it mimics the convocation of the Senate. The way that everything was done outwardly, the the positions in the council, the way things were recorded, all these things were they were vehicles that were known by the non-Christian world. And so these were adoptions by the church of the Greco-Roman political structure. And so if we don't understand that difference, and this is why the emperor played such an important role, is because the Council of Nicaea was not like an extra set of sheets of paper to add to the Bible. This was a civil and secular matter just as much as it was religious. And so we would expect to see the emperor and the civil magistrates playing the role that they played.
All right, Eric, you ready to keep going?
Yeah.
And here you have Emperor Constantine convoking the council. He paid for the bishop's travel and lodging. He opened the council with a speech. He chaired at least some of the proceedings and participated in the various discussions. And afterward, he enforced exile on dissenters. And so it's commonly stated that he presided over this council. You'll find this language a lot, like here in the Encyclopedia Britannica in their entry on the Council of Nicaea. Presided over the opening session and took part in the discussions is the language there. Dvornik notes that the proceedings at Nicaea are actually modeled after the Roman Senate. Quote, the emperor convoked the bishops as he convoked the senators, presided at sessions of the council as he presided at the Senate. And after making relatio, called upon the members to state their point of view. The word relatio there refers to making a motion in the Senate, and then the subsequent phrase there is used for asking for opinions or taking votes in the Senate proceeding. That's how the Roman Senate would function. However, we need to be careful about Nicaea 1 because, and this is what the more recent scholarship talks about, is that we don't have as much information about Nicaea 1 in terms of the moment-by-moment unfolding from one session to another as we do at later councils like Chalcedon, the Fourth Ecumenical Council. Richard Price notes, it used to be common to attribute the presidency at the Council of Nicaea to either the Emperor Constantine or Osius of Corduba. That's one of the more important bishops there. Though more recent studies admit that we have no real information on the identity of the chairman or chairmen. So he's saying we don't know exactly how it's unfolding. And that's why I offer this more general term of oversee rather than presided. So he's just stepping back a bit because saying we don't know all the details, but we can summarize it like this. Imperial presidency is true in the sense that the emperors oversaw the meetings, even if there's uncertainty or variation in terms of personal chairing of discussions. So that's what, when you hear talk about the presidency of the emperor, that's what we're talking about, this imperial oversight. But, you also do have emperors making their own personal and direct theological contributions. Emperors are not voting members, but sometimes they do steer things theologically. And even at Nicaea 1, the early church historian Eusebius claims that the inclusion of the word homoousion was advised by Emperor Constantine. You can see what I've emboldened here in this quote, that the emperor advised all present to agree to it and to subscribe to its articles and to assent to them with the insertion of the single word homoousion, and then it gives his own interpretation and understanding of that. What Dvornik does is go through...
So, Eric, I wanted to ask you something that I mentioned when you were gone in the stream. But basically, when I hear Gavin make this point, kind of calling into question, like, okay, look, the emperors are kind of giving their theology. Look at Nicaea 1, where Constantine is the one who kind of imposes the word homoousios, right? I can't help but think about like those liberal Protestant and liberal secular historians who claim that, Nicaea 1 created Christianity and enforced this vision of the Trinity and Christ having two natures and all that. That it was this imperial corruption of Christianity, whereas before it was this diverse Christianities or whatever, what have you. And I'm always kind of thinking to myself, like, okay, what is Gavin getting at with this? Because, he's going after the papacy, but then somebody could look at this and say, yeah, but what about the idea of the homoousios itself? Was that just an imperial imposition? I've heard people who reject the Trinity make that argument, from a historical perspective. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, look, Constantine he saw himself responsible for the health of the Christian unity in the state. And so he knew that Rome, he knew that several bishops in the East who followed the same teaching as Rome held to the homoousios. And so that, St. Athanasius, when he's defending the doctrine, he never cites the authority of Constantine, right? He actually said that Rome held a synod in 261, already codified consubstantia, translated to Greek. And so this, the religious debates were not found. Nobody said, well, Constantine is the one who flexed,
right,
the authority to push this in through. No, they were concerned about the truth of the faith from Scripture as handed down through the episcopate, of which the Apostolic See was the supreme chair. But if Ortlund, and I don't know if he is, I don't know if he's using this as a way to argue against the papacy. He doesn't necessarily have to. These points are all conformal. They can conform to our doctrine of papal supremacy in history. And so what he's stating here, it may be heard by some of the listeners as, like, not Constantine. It's Constantine, the one that ran the show there. And so when a Protestant who, just got done watching Luther on TV, when he listens to this, he's like, oh, the Council of Nicaea, the Pope's supposed to be there and all his, all of his authority and this and that. But we got to get back into that time, that time frame. Rome wasn't very excited about these imperial endeavors. Rome, it takes until the Council of either Ephesus or Chalcedon for Rome to really invest itself into these imperial projects. And then later they become sacred monuments. By the time Gregory the Great talks about the 4 ecumenical councils, Gospels. But at first, Pope Sylvester is just like, sure, we'll send a couple of guys over there. He's not thinking, what the emperor's doing in Nicaea, that's just going to be absolutely, the one thing we've been waiting for is the Roman king to bring the ultimate authority of Christ into effect. Nobody was thinking that. They were thinking, look, the emperor wants to make this thing state official. Let's go along with what he wants, with what he's doing.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's keep going.
Constantine's letters to gather a sense of his own self-perception, and it's astonishingly high. Emperor Constantine construed himself to be the representative of God on earth. And so he claimed a kind of domain over both civil and ecclesiastical matters. You can see on screen how Dvornik puts that. And this is significant because subsequent councils then look to Nicaea I as a blueprint. Now, there's variation, okay? So there's imperial presidency in the sense of there's always imperial oversight of the councils, the 7 ecumenical councils. That's constant. So that's just flatly correct. What I said is correct, And that's why I just want people to be clear about that. But the expression of that varies. Sometimes, for example, it's through representatives. Theodosius I still oversaw Constantinople 381, Second Ecumenical Council, but this is arguably a little different. He had arguably less direct influence, and he'd already legislated Nicene orthodoxy before the council began. And then leading up to that, there had been such struggle throughout the 4th century, it was contested. What are the exact roles of the emperor versus various church authorities, and so on and so forth. Nonetheless, the basic role of the emperor really isn't in that much dispute. Dvornik discusses the disputes and then says, in spite of the bitterness which this first conflict must have left in the minds of many bishops, there was no great change in the general appreciation of the emperor's leading role in the church. So you can see, for example, the 150 bishops of the 381 council writing a letter to Theodosius after saying, having rendered to God the thanks due to him, we must lay before your piety what has been decided in this holy council. We therefore ask your clemency that a letter of your piety should ratify the decrees of this council. As you honored the church by your letter of convocation, so also lend your authority to our decisions. So this is like anything in history. You get into the details of it and you see there's lots of nuance. But the big picture here of imperial presidency, imperial oversight, which is a significant role, is not really in dispute. Now, Ephesus in 431, Ecumenical Council number 3 is.
Do you want to say anything so far, Eric, or we can keep going?
Well, just one brief thing. I mean, again, that language of ratify our decisions, again, it almost appears as though like there's this judicial forum that the bishops are having to pen their decisions to, like as if, well, we've made our decisions, O great emperor. What we need is for you to ratify them so that we can know that they have authority now. But that's not what any of the bishops there were thinking. What they were thinking is what all of the Christianized Hellenists were thinking, which is, look, we know what the Church of God believes, but you, O king, in position by divine right, we need you to publicize this in the temporal realm so that there's that extra vehicle for the true faith to flourish against aberrations and errors and all the other things that would have more opportunities had the emperor not ratified the council. So we got to keep that in mind, that the bishops here are not trying to get the emperor to add something to ecclesiastical authority. They're just wanting the emperor to do his job in the secular sphere.
All right, let's keep going.
It's really messy because Emperor Theodosius II worked through an imperial commissioner whose role was not to make theological contributions, but to oversee the proceedings. But things sort of got out of control. So Cyril of Alexandria opened the council before the Antiochene bishops arrived. And then when they got there, they were furious and had their own counter council. Nonetheless, both sides are appealing to imperial ratification because it's that determines which council's acts would have legal force in the empire. And Emperor Theodosius II sort of vacillates on this a bit, trying to determine which one is legitimate. He actually imprisoned bishops from both sides at points, but he eventually sided with the Cyrillian side. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 arguably had the most direct imperial control, at least of these first 4 ecumenical councils. Emperor Marcion convoked the council, and then imperial commissioners presided and exercised tight procedural control. The only exception to that would be session 3. But basically, the imperial commissioners are determining who speaks. They're requiring concise speech, and they're steering the council toward overturning Ephesus II, the robber council of 2 years prior in 449. And so you can read through the Acts of Chalcedon and just see the imperial officials kind of strictly managing the floor. And this is interesting because here it is that Pope Leo I has such a significant role. Nonetheless, Dvornik describes the role of the Roman bishop at this council as kind of like a speaker of the house. And then he notes the leading of the debates remained imperial prerogatives. And that's not exceptional. I quote from Dvornik a lot. I really kind of like his writing. But Henry Chadwick says the same thing about Chalcedon. John Meyendorff says the same thing. Richard Price. Many other historians say the same thing. This is not really in dispute. George Bevan has a good overview.
Maybe we can stop here. Or actually, what I'll do is I'll let him finish this quote, and then we'll talk about Chalcedon. How does that sound?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right.
Of these first 4 sessions at Chalcedon, and you can see this longer text on screen. He talks about session 3 as an exception, but because the Roman legates lead that session, nonetheless, other than that, Chalcedon is presided over and run by the imperial commissioners. Here's how Philip Schaff puts it: in the Council of Chalcedon in 451, the papal influence is for the first time decidedly prominent, but even there, it appears in virtual subordination to the higher authority of the council, which did not suffer itself to be disturbed by the protest of Leo against this 28th canon in reference to the rank of the Patriarch of Constantinople. He's talking about the imperial authority there. And I have more on that particular canon that Schaff just referenced in this video on screen if you're interested in that.
All right, so we can stop there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There might be a transparent intention of Ortlund to try and say that, like, at Chalcedon, um, the imperial commissioners were really the decisive factor in the faith, or even that the council itself was over the Roman bishop, and that would be false. That would be false. And that, I mean, there is ample data to show that. He used as one example, and Schaff is the one who, to be fair to Ortlund, he's quoting Philip Schaff, the 28th canon of the count 16th session. Well, the papal legates protested this, right? And if it was the case that the council said, well, we respect the authority of Rome, but in this case, because Rome is inferior, we're going to go and pass this anyway. If that was the case, then why would Emperor Marcion send another request to the Pope to ratify the 28th canon? Why would the Patriarch of Constantinople likewise ask the Bishop of Rome to ratify it? And then, secondly, when the Bishop of Rome wrote back like 5 or 6 letters, Pope Leo the Great, saying, no, this can't be done by the authority of St. Peter. I annul this. It's completely void. Why is it that the emperor and the patriarch responded and said, so be it? All of the decrees depended on the authority of your holiness. And Dvornik, if we're going to include him in a reliable wrap of scholars, he notates that in several of the Byzantine codified numberings, only 27 canons appear throughout the 5th century. And it's not until the 6th century, the syntagma of 14 titles, that we see the 28th canon. We also see that emperors and patriarchs of Constantinople continued to ask Rome throughout the 5th century for Rome to accept that canon. So if the council had its way successfully, there should have never been any more queries, or there should have never been any more requests for Rome to ratify that canon.
Yeah, and it's one thing to know the secondary literature and be able to cite scholars who kind of say the things that you want them to say when they agree with you, but it's another thing to like go to the primary sources and flesh out the full picture. And I feel like, Eric, in your research, this is something I've always appreciated, where you get into the nitty-gritty and you kind of give the full picture. And like if you were listening, it seems like to me, it's really Gavin's willing to say, okay, yeah, Pope Leo, he had some influence. All right, I'll give you that. But it wasn't that much. And it's like, well, when you start looking a bit deeper, it's a bit more than just what Schaff might be letting on, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's just pages and pages of the data from the council, the sessions, the scholarly commentaries on the sessions, But to be fair to Ortlund, there are scholars who look at this and say, yeah, well, there were also bishops that just didn't submit. They didn't think that Rome could make a decision that was binding in the East. Even Richard Price makes that, he makes that observation. But that just affords an opportunity for us to get deeper into that question. Why do you come to that conclusion? Mm-hmm. And then we can dig into their sources and other sources, but that takes time. If Ortlund wants to do that, I'd be more than happy.
Yeah, I hope he takes you up on that. All right, let's keep going.
Pope Leo himself recognized the emperor's role with respect to both the civil and religious realms. In a 457 letter to Emperor Leo, he wrote, for example, royal power has been bestowed on you not merely to rule the world, but chiefly to protect the church. And this was a common way of thinking. Dvornik goes again through Pope Leo's letters and he even suggests that Pope Leo believed in a kind of imperial infallibility, because you have all this language about how the Holy Spirit protects the emperor from error in certain contexts and so forth. I was shocked by that sentence from Dvornik. I don't know what to make of that myself. That's interesting.
Are you familiar with that passage from Dvornik, or what Ortlund is referencing there?
Yes, yeah, I'm familiar with it. Dvornik is commenting on a section of Leo, wherein he talks about the faith of the emperor being, protected by Almighty God, and that's just not very odd. You see this quite a bit in the literature. Popes writing to emperors, emperors writing to patriarchs, and things like this. That's not a it's not a serious claim, to like real infallibility. Now, it's not completely empty either, right? Because Leo does look at Emperor Marcion as a spirit-filled Christian. And so what do spirit-filled Christians have guidance from? The Holy Spirit. Leo looks at Marcion as the divinely appointed king over the empire. That's literal. I mean, that's full. That's not even an honorific that's partially full. He thinks that Marcion really does occupy a divinely instituted role in the secular realm. We can quote Romans 13, we can quote Proverbs, we can quote a lot of things. But so that's, but we shouldn't take that and magnify it the way that it sounds like he thinks Dvornik might be doing. What about when you've got the 28th canon problem coming up in Leo's mind, and then he says, no, we can't do this because secular things remain on a different foundation than divine. Now, there he's being more, he's making his distinctions a little bit more clear. The secular realm is got its own realm, but the apostolic, that's of a deeper divine foundation. And that was one of the reasons why he wouldn't allow, Canon 28. So right there, I mean, if we were supposed to think that Pope Leo the Great thought that the emperor was this infallible teacher, that we have to obey him, why would he make this concrete argument against Canon 28 on this, the principle of inferiority, secular underneath divine? The only way he could make that argument is if he really didn't see the emperor as superior.
Right.
And so that question is really out of the picture.
All right, let's keep going.
After Chalcedon, you see even stronger forms of what some historians will call Caesaro-papism, where the role of the emperor takes on a new kind of supremacy in various ways. And so you'll find more language about emperors as inspired by the Holy Spirit, along with all these exalted titles like equal of the apostles, light of orthodoxy, co-worker with God, guardian of the truth, all this kind of exalted language for the emperor in his role in the church as well as in the state. And during this time, you've got emperors giving theological edicts, exiling popes like Pope Martin I. And then the ecumenical councils during this time, numbers 5, 6, and 7, have heavy imperial management. Nicaea II, for example, was basically an Empress Irene show. The council's proceedings and outcome are strictly determined by imperial pressure, and that's pretty much universally acknowledged. I don't think anybody really questions that, even if the ecumenical patriarch Theresias of Constantinople is sort of formally leading meetings. Nonetheless, here's how Richard Price puts it: the council was strictly controlled, with the bishops acting the part that had been assigned to them. Again, Richard Price is not alone. So often this happens where I'm simply summarizing something that everybody says and everybody sees in the scholarship, and then people react really strongly to it. That's why I'm laying this all out in a video, to help onlookers realize, oh, what Gavin said is basically just correct, and you can just be settled in your view of that. So you can see why the language of the presidency of the emperor is standard in the literature. Again, the issue here, the only qualification is just that whoever's hearing you say that won't misunderstand the presiding word. The nature of the presiding varied. It wasn't always, direct managerial control over the proceedings. Sometimes it's through a delegate, and sometimes it's more of a hands-off approach, but he's still overseeing it, convoking it, overseeing, ratifying, etc. So that's.
I'll just pause there. So do you want to talk about his characterization of Nicaea II? I mean, he kind of threw out a lot of examples, rapid fire. Talked about Pope Martin being exiled, all that. I mean, or imprisoned or exiled. And
Yes.
there's and it's always funny, Eric, because like it's always easy to just launch all these things in a 20-minute video, but then to actually unpack and go through what each of those points are, it's going to take like over an hour.
Yeah.
So Eric, how do you want to do this? Focus on Nicaea 2. What are your thoughts?
Well, he mentioned Pope Martin the First, right? Which is interesting because that's the Pope that presided over the Council of Rome 649, otherwise known as, or also known as the Lateran Synod 649. And the scholarship on that is pretty interesting. Basically, the best of the scholarship on that comments on how at least Maximus the Confessor, Pope Theodore, Pope Martin, and several other bishops in the West at the time that were monodiothelite in their Christology, they believed that Rome could successfully make a decree over and against the imperial East, which at the time was heavily monothelite. So the fact that an emperor can send men to capture the Pope and exile him is as significant in that period as if it happened today.
Right. It's just a show of blunt power, but not of divine, origin or divine will, structure, what have you. Yeah.
Right.
Institution.
Because the next emperors who, when Constans the Second, Constans the Second, otherwise known as Constant the Bearded One, his son Constantine the Fourth, he ended up reaching out to Pope Donus and said, "Hey, listen, we're ready to get our house straight over here. You need to send people over here to set the Greeks right." And then Pope Donum died. Donum or Donus, I think it's Donum. He dies, and Pope Agatho is the Pope who takes on the role, and he sends delegates to the Constantinople, and you should read the instructions that they opened the council with. They're making bold claims to two things. So we want to make Ortlund happy here because Agatho says that the sacred role of the emperor and his authority to convoke the council is very much helpful to the church. But then he runs up next to it that emperors, bishops, churches, councils, since the beginning, have always been inferior, subservient, and dependent upon the charism of the Bishop of Rome, who is the successor of St. Peter. And so you have it's not like Pope Agatho is there to say, "Hey, Ortlund, everything you're saying is wrong." What he's there to say is, no, yes, yeah. The imperial framework had its place, but it never had a superior place or a superior role in the determination of the faith. And so that's what's missing. I would say it's missing from his presentation. I think I'm comfortable.
Missing.
I think I'm comfortable saying that because who's going to listen to this from Grace Baptist Church or First Presbyterian of Tuscaloosa? Who is going to listen to this video and think to themselves, "Oh, this has no negative value against the papacy"? Of course they are taking it as negative value against the papacy. You're saying the empire ran things, that they're the ones that had this role that the popes should have had if Catholicism was true. I don't think he ever says that explicitly here, but whether he knows it or not, the listeners, and I'm speaking now about other people besides Ortlund, the Protestants who are listening to this, they are certainly going to think, "Wow, this is ammunition, guys."
Right.
Nobody's going to listen to this and say, this is great scholarship that both Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants can benefit from. That's not going to be the takeaway. You asked about Irene.
Yeah, Nicaea too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe Eric, if I can just say a little bit about that
Go
too,
ahead.
just
Yeah,
Nicaea too.
please.
I mean, like you have imperial iconoclasm, and I guess you have imperial dualism, right? Or
Yeah.
philism, whatever you want to call it. So,
Yeah.
uh, either way, the empire is weighing in. I don't know if it's really fair to say. I mean, maybe this isn't a hill I will die on, but if Taurasios is just really the puppet of Irene, or the empire, but certainly, like with Hadrian's contribution to that council and Irene's letter to beckon him to, weigh in on the council as well, it seems as if she recognized, maybe even if it were just for totally political reasons, that you need the Bishop of Rome to be involved, right? And the Bishop of Rome, Hadrian, certainly thought he was essential to that council. And I always love that part in the letter when he's like, "Why are you calling Taurasios the ecumenical patriarch when that's what I am?" I love
Yeah.
that part. Anyway, Eric, you take it away.
Yeah, well, again, context, historical, geopolitical, context. Hey, Irene is looking at what has been going on in the East, not just in the religious places. It's in the public sphere. There's blood being shed over these things. People were losing their jobs over having icons, and iconoclasm was just as much an upheaval to society in the
Mm.
East as today. Let's just try to bring it to our context. If tomorrow we had something that affects everyone in their day-to-day lives happen, that the White House has to respond to, right? Uh, the White House, if it's a religious matter and you're in a context where the state and the church are married together, they cooperate together. It's going to be in the hands of Donald Trump to make a move, right? We need to bring peace back to California, or it's this is not just like the seminaries, right? Like when a Protestant reads Empress Irene running the show, they're thinking of like today, like what's going on, the debates in the seminaries, and things like this. No, iconoclasm was something out in the open. Soldiers were affected by this. The safety of the public was. I mean, you could go to a city and they would hang people up on display with their icons to show what they did to people who had icons.
Hmm.
This is not just the Pope of Rome should be the one to roll in and swoop in and say something. No, that's a state issue. Okay, so Irene is doing exactly what her office is designed for. Okay, that's why the Bishop of Rome, Hadrian, writes back and he says, absolutely, you use your supreme majesty as the potentate of the realm to convoke this council. And you know what we're going to do? We're going to tell you exactly what Jesus teaches. And you take what we teach and you implement it into the society of Christians. And by the way, if you don't, you're bound out of the kingdom of God. So that is what Hadrian that is what he says in a nutshell. So again, I think what's missing here is it's not stated, okay. And to be fair to Ortlund, let him make clear if he doesn't realize that this presentation, it could be taken, or it will probably be taken as ammunition, a historical ammunition against Vatican I's claims. I don't know anybody who's a Protestant who's going to listen to this and not come away feeling edified in his understanding that history is against Catholicism.
Right. Well, Eric, I mean, I know you're trying to be charitable, but I think like he pulled up a video earlier about, like, was it the early church versus Vatican I? We see the argument that he was making in that screenshot I showed you.
Yeah, and I didn't see
from the
this.
book.
Yeah, I didn't see this
Yeah.
before. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, so I think like it's very clear that he's using this against Vatican I, Catholicism, the papacy. I think.
Yeah, he says in contrast in the book there.
Right.
Yeah, so he by that word, he's trying to say Vatican I says this. In contrast, we
History
see
says this. Yeah.
history says this. Yeah.
All right. Let's see if we can finish up the video and we can get to some comments.
It's what you have to bear in mind when we speak of the presidency of the emperor. Okay, so why does all this matter? Well, it's a great example of the point that I was making in my initial video on Protestantism and church history about being honest about the changes that take place in church history and the impossibility of maintaining the same formal procedural methods from one time and place to another. And so, because these changes happen at the most fundamental workings of the church, like ecumenical councils. And the appeal is we've got to be honest with these historical facts. And then we've got to find a way to just, basically, we need a theory of ecclesial transmission, the movement of the true church from one context to another, where we can account for that. And so what that forces you to get into is to distinguish between what's essential to the church and what's accidental to the church. And the point about the role of the Roman Empire is that things can be very significant in the church while still being accidental to her very essence. So, and I've said more about that in that video. So that's it, really. This is not the first time, and it certainly won't be the last time where someone seizes on something that I say and tries to sort of blow it up as this major error when it's actually fairly standard. But in this case, it's good because it just gives us a chance to drill into this and work through some of the facts and kind of lay things out. And hopefully the goal here is just that onlookers who are curious about this have a little more information about the significant role of the emperor in these early councils. All right. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Okay. So we can stop there. Eric, I was kind of chuckling near the end because, I mean, you talk about how in the second millennium, right, things did change. And it is true that this imperial involvement, which was once like so prominent, started kind of eroding and going away, right? And I don't think we would disagree much that like that was always accidental, even if it was prominent, right? So we are getting at the question of what is the essence of the church, and is the papacy part of the essence of the church?
Yes. Yeah. No, I think the distinction that he was drawing there at the end is a valid one.
Right.
There are things that are accidental, things that are substantial, but the issue there is I think he's taking the imperial influence that was in place, and he's saying that had a role in the church. Yes, it did. But I don't think what's getting explained enough in the video is that at the time, the church would not, even if the church had infallible authority like we claim she does, even if that was clear, the church knew that it wasn't her office to enforce the decrees of Nicaea
Right.
in Syria, or over the public magistrate of Egypt, or in the to validate who has the right to trade on the sea, on the shores of Carthage, or I'm sorry, on the shores between Rome and Africa, where if you weren't a Catholic, things were different. You had to pass that validation. These are civil matters like the DMV. This is outward public society. Things are happening that it looks purely religious because it's talking about Jesus and doctrine and what needs to be believed. But the emperor, really, it was his job to write these edicts to put up on the bus stops of the 4th, 5th, 6th century. Now when we see a bus stop, you see, not an edict, but they'll say, here's a new law number, statute of Seminole County or whatever, notice to citizens, right? Back then they would have done that with an edict. Like, for example, after the Council of Constantinople III, Emperor Constantine IV wrote an edict condemning monothelitism, right? And the Pope, who had already ratified the council, he already thought that Pope Agatho's letter was final. He wrote that he translated that edict into Latin, or I don't know if he did the translating work, but he wrote letters to Spain saying you guys all have to abide by this imperial edict, right? Because that, in other words, that the consequences in that edict were effective. One of them was exile, right? The Bishop of Rome's not going to execute that. That's not his office. So we've got to understand those two swords, the spiritual sword, the temporal sword. So it's not as if all this great prominence of the empire was working in the church. That's not really the issue there. The issue is you've got two swords at work. The church was doing her responsibility. The state had to do its responsibility. But that's kind of out of touch with Protestant sensibilities, because most often today they have the teaching, the classic Protestant teaching where church and state remain. Well, not, I should, let me correct myself. That's actually not classical Protestant teaching. The Lutherans, the Calvinists did not believe it. But today, in the more like, in the evangelical world, and the more, the Protestants and the Lutherans and the Calvinists who have sort of detached from that older church state doctrine, they don't have a sensibility that, oh, wait a minute, Constantine's just doing what he's supposed to do. The church can't do anything about the roadways, and whether, how that's going to favor the heretics, or it's going to favor the Orthodox, whether it's going to favor the Donatists, or it's going to favor the people who, Pope Miltiades, who condemned them.
Yeah, and another point that Gavin made at the end of his video was that he was talking about, how the church changes over time, and he was kind of saying, which hypothesis makes the best sense of that. And just from a Catholic perspective, using the same distinction of the essence or the substance of the church versus what's accidental, we could make sense of the data by saying that the substance of the papacy was always there. You had this prominent, no doubt, but accidental feature of the empire and the emperor's involvement in the process, right? But nonetheless, like when you see in the second millennium, as you were talking about, that kind of accidental feature is shaved away and the substance is still there. I mean, that's how we would interpret the data. And just because, let's say, we hold that this is the substance, that the papacy is part of the substance of the church, that doesn't mean that the papacy will crowd out everything else, like the empire, the emperor, and their role in the mix, right? And I mean, at the end of the day, we're making a claim that Christ 2,000 years ago, right, founded the office of the papacy. And whether or not, the emperor was always acting with the reverence due to that office, whatever. I mean, that's a separate question, right? And so, long story short, I just I just don't really see this taking us anywhere in the conversation, to be totally honest. Yeah,
there's a lot missing. Yeah, because while we do have, like you were making reference to, we do have Caesaro-Papist interventions. Justinian, we see, the emperors that like in the 4th century, that were convoking imperial synods and sending into exile Athanasius, Hilary of Poitiers, and yes, there were those who, they usurped a greater authority than they actually had. But what's missing from the presentation, again, in this whole context of Catholicism, Vatican I versus history, is the positive evidence of the presence of the papacy in its full orbit, in its full presence as a divine organ that is superior to the emperor, the empire, the imperial commissioners, and all those things.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of, like, sometimes when I'm talking with, my friends who are like secular historians, and they look at the same data, but they don't read it in light of divine providence, and they just view it as like politics and the workings of men throughout history. Or even when they look at the early church and they just see, propaganda, whatever, they don't see the Holy Spirit at work as being the glue that connects the church today with the church then. Anyway. Okay, here are some questions, Eric. So, let's see here. Eric, the Good Fight Tony L asked, how much can we trust Eusebius regarding Constantine's suggestion of homoousios?
I mean, we don't really have a lot of contest to that. Eusebius is one of those sources that it's like, well, we don't have any contenders to oppose him, and so there's really no reason to doubt what he's saying. I mean, there's no doubt that he what's the right way of saying this? He aggrandizes Constantine and his Vita Constantine, this life of Constantine. But that's literature for you. We still do that today,
All right. Michoville asked, if emperors were essential, why isn't Arminium EC? Do you know what he's referring to there?
Yeah. The Council of it's some people call it the Council of Rimini. It's a city in Italy, or Arminium. Yeah, So he's got a good question. That council was huge. I mean, I think it was like over 400 bishops there, and it was called and it was convoked by a semi-Arian emperor. I think it was Constans II, I believe. I could have that wrong. Or Constantius. I think it's one of the sons of Constantine. And basically Pope Liberius, he wrote an edict after that and it said, yeah, this whole thing is null.
Right.
It's interesting. A lot of people don't remember Pope Liberius for that. Our Oriental Orthodox friends do. They venerate Pope Liberius. But yeah, so Pope Liberius basically said that's shot completely null. His successor, Pope Damasus, wrote a letter to the East complaining about that council. And he said, yeah, that council that everybody talks about, how there was bishops from everywhere, he says, yeah, he basically says this in a nutshell. I cover this on the section of Pope Damasus in my book. Yeah, it really doesn't mean much. You know why? I wasn't there and no representative of mine was there. So, because you had several attempts of Constantius or Constans II, I can't remember which one's which, to have councils that were amending, improving Nicaea. And they all claimed imperial convocation. They all had the emperor behind it. In fact, what Michoville Pledikos is asking here is actually in sync with Maximus the Confessor, because when Maximus the Confessor was abducted and put into captivity in Constantinople, he was interrogated by some tough Byzantine officers, and one of the questions that they brought to him was, how can you say the Council of Lateran 649 has any authority if the emperor didn't convoke it? Right. One of the retorts of Maximus was, what about Constantius and Rimini? That was convened. That was convened by an emperor, and yet you don't hold that. So,
All right. Maximus to the rescue. I love the guy. All right. Enslaved by Truth 2, he asked, Council of Jerusalem, in response to when you said, was it ecumenical councils are like created by the empire? They're not divine institutions, or
Yes, that's a very great question. A very good question. So after the Council of Jerusalem, the church did continue to hold local synods, metropolitical synods, and they would look back to that first synod of the apostles as a paradigm. So one of the earliest authors who gives us vivid descriptions of this would be Saint Cyprian of Carthage. He talks about because Carthage was a metropolis city, and he was sort of like the archbishop of that province, and so he talked about the convocation of synods. Don't we talk about the synods of Carthage in 257 and all those? But they all looked at those efforts as sort of like repeating what the apostles did. But that's different than what we see with Nicaea 325. In fact, that's different than what we see with the very first time Constantine did this, which is in Arles in 314. Constantine called bishops from Arles, from Rome, from Africa to look again at the issue of Donatism. That is different That was something that Constantine did. Rome the Bishop of Rome was yawning over this whole thing. Those kind of councils were created by the empire. Now, did the imperial project and the divine church merge together in those events? Yes, they did. But we need to understand that the skeletal structure of an emperor and his commissioners convoking a council, reading the imperial sacra in mimicking the old senatorial meetings of Rome, having this person writing the minutes, that person governing the sessions, assigning when the beginning, when the end of things are happening. That's all empire stuff. That's all Roman stuff. That stuff was adopted. The church to say, okay, if Rome wants to help us out, we'll bring what we've always done to the place that they've assigned, and we'll do business there. And so the church and the state merged in that instance.
Right. Let me see if there's one more question that I can ask you, Eric, from the audience. So let's see here. Well, I thought Tony L made a really good point here. He said, so when the Pope praises the faith of the emperor, it's not empty honorifics now. It reminded me earlier when Gavin cited, like, what was it, the emperor talking about himself in this very exalted way. And then it's like when we Catholics bring up quotes of popes talking about the office of the papacy, they're like, look at the Pope talking about himself. Okay, so it's like, when we do it, it doesn't matter. But when it's for something against Catholicism, there's something to pay attention to right there.
Yeah, it's imperial infallibility. Yeah.
Not just Byzantine flattery anymore. Anyway, there aren't really any other further questions in the audience, so I think we can end the episode here. Oh, wait. Okay, hold on. We got one question recently. And this will be the last one, I think. So Sir Cadzalot asks, is an ex-cathedra statement, similar to a one-person ecumenical council? You talked about this before. Right. Do you want to take this on, or?
Yeah. It is. So it is similar in the sense that the effect is a dogmatically binding teaching that binds every soul in the Catholic Church. So that would be the product of an ex-cathedra statement, or an ecumenical council. But we've got to be careful here, right? Because a one-person ecumenical council is just as contradictory as saying a one grape cluster of grapes, right? It doesn't. You can't say one person ecumenical council, because by definition it is an effort by the bishops of the world underneath the presidency of the head of the Episcopal College, the Bishop of Rome. So that is what an ecumenical council is by definition. So one person ecumenical council would be like me saying, my name's not Eric, I don't speak English, I'm not a human being, and you can't hear me talking. So in that case, it's a contradiction of terms, sure. But it is similar in the sense that it does produce a universally binding infallible decree. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it reminds me of, what is it? I think Elijah Yassi brought this up, like, or he was mentioning something that you had made, or a point that you had made, but it's not like the Pope can get two bishops in his office and say he's at an ecumenical council.
Yeah,
right?
You can't do that, yeah.
Right, a council has a certain form to it that it's supposed to have if it's going to represent the Episcopal College. There has to be like an effort to actually represent the brother bishops.
That's right.
All right. Well, I think that's all the time that we have tonight. But Eric, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening, your night, to come onto the channel again. And it's so good to see you. And if you ever want to come on again, just let me know, and I'd love to host you.
Yeah, this is fun. Sorry about the problem with the internet. That just, maybe it afforded you some space for a good commentary. I'll go back and listen.
Oh, sure. Okay. All right. Thank you, Eric. And to everybody, good night, and go to Mass. All right. Go to Mass.